Okay, well, hello everyone. Welcome to the UNFCCC Pavilion. And that means welcome to everyone in the pavilion, in real person, but also everyone online today. We have a great audience online around the world. Now this is actually the fifth session in a Sustainable Systems series that we've been holding here at Citi. We've had some fantastic speakers on sustainability and climate action, speaking to our audience around the world. That means our clients, it means thousands of people at Citigroup itself, and in over 95 countries around the world. Now this is now day 4 of the conference. The first 2 days we had the world leaders here. Yesterday, of course, we had Finance Day, very relevant to a bank like Citi. And today is Energy Day. But maybe even more importantly, tomorrow is Youth Day. So we're truly delighted to be welcoming one of the great leaders and young people here at the conference, climate justice activist Xiye Bastide, as our special guest. Now, many of you in the pavilion today will know Xiye very well and what she's been achieving, what she's been doing, but many online may not know Xiye. So I would like to quickly introduce her. Xiye is a 19-year-old activist from the Otomi Toltec indigenous community in Mexico. She grew up in a small town in central Mexico, moved to New York about 5 years ago with her parents, and she became an active in climate justice and activism a few years ago, and is now a keynote speaker at many of the global events, including the United Nations Climate Summit, the Nobel Prize Summit, Global Citizens, and she was a youth speaker at the President Biden Climate Summit in April. Maybe even more importantly, she's a student at the University of Pennsylvania studying environmental studies, and we thank her for taking the time out of her studies, and hopefully not out of her exams, to be joining us in Glasgow. So thank you, Xiye. Now look, we're also greatly honoured to be joined by 2 other great climate champions in Sylvia Earle and Professor Johan Rockstrom. As you all know, Sylvia is one of the great oceanographers, explorers. I'm very jealous about her exploration feats around the world, and particularly deep in the oceans, where I have not been, and one of the great advocates for the oceans over many, many decades. Johan, of course, is an Earth Systems scientist at the Potsdam Institute and co-creator of the planetary boundaries concepts and framework, and a leading thinker in science planetary tipping points. Now, both Johan and Sylvia have been guest speakers on our sessions previously, so both have been very generous to actually join me on stage to be talking with Xiye. So thank you to all of you. So why don't we start about here and now, COP26. Obviously, this is, as I said, day 4. We've got 30,000 or so delegates and attendees here, and many more who aren't inside the zone, many who are outside and will be talking and marching on Saturday. Xiye, you spoke to the world leaders on Monday, and would like to hear your hopes, aspirations. What are your key messages that you are giving to the world leaders, but also to the private sector, to the companies, the banks, the major companies, the investors? I mean, at the end of the day, you've got the most at stake, you and your generation. So what are your key messages, and do you feel that you and your generation are actually at the negotiation table?
Well, hi everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you for being here as well. My name is Xiye Bastide, and I am one of the very lucky activists who was actually able to be at COP. And I spoke at the World Leaders Summit on the closing on Monday, and it was a very important experience for me, because I think it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to speak at the World Leaders Summit to 130 leaders who came from all over the world. But even though we had that opportunity, it didn't really feel like they were listening. And the reason why I say this is because as I was going on stage, most of the leaders that had been present had actually walked out of the room. And I know that I was, still speaking to the cameras, still speaking to people who are outside of that room and beyond. But that hurt, because we do so much as youth activists to be able to be on these spaces. I am missing school right now, which is really hard for me because I love school. And we come all the way here and we don't feel heard. And so my dad told me that I did my job because I put the message out there, and now it's their turn to receive the message. It's their turn to accept and realized what we are going through as kids who have to take time out of our lives and be here. So my expectations and our hopes and our demands are that they take us seriously, that they take the generational injustice that the climate crisis is seriously, because I have not been seeing that at all. We are seeing ecosystems collapsing. We are seeing my hometown flooded in 2015 for the first time, and it has happened since, something my grandma had never seen in her 92 years of life. And they are not realizing that, especially youth in the global south, are seeing the climate crisis in a very tangible way that is not being seen as tangible in the global north. And there has to be a commitment for rich countries to close the gap. For example, today's Energy Day, we were talking about how there's a lot of people in the global south who don't even have access to energy. So how do you get them to do it in a sustainable way if they don't even have access to it in the first place? I don't want to go on and on, but just for companies, it's the same thing. We need companies to, and we'll get into this later, but to be on the side and the right side of history. And I know that we have been pushing in the streets as youth activists. We have been striking for almost 2 years, and we're going to have a strike tomorrow. But we are not seeing the shift that needs to happen, the shift in consciousness that needs to happen, the shift in culture, treating the climate crisis as something that is so embedded in our lives that we need to make every decision thinking about how we're going to address it. And I'm not seeing that at all. Youth activists are not seeing that at all. We are playing with numbers, talking about 1.5 and 2 degrees like they're interchangeable, and they're not. And I know Johan can speak on that very well. But these are real things to us.
Thank you, Xiye. On a similar note, in terms of being at the negotiation table, Sylvia, the oceans. You've been deep in the oceans. You've experienced the ocean over many, many decades. You've seen the changes. Are the oceans at the negotiation tables? Are they embedded in the thinking when it comes to the negotiators and also the private sector who are here today and this week?
Well, the climate conference in Madrid / Chile was billed as the blue COP. We kind of gotten away from that. So the expectation was that here in Glasgow, the ocean would be front and center. There's still a chance to do that. After all, the ocean drives climate and weather. It's where 97% of Earth's water is. It's where most of life on Earth is. It's where most of the wildlife on the planet is. And we're treating ocean life more as commodities than as wildlife. We measure wild animals from the ocean by the ton. We market them as products. And making the connection, not just with the ocean as rocks and water, not just the ocean as the physical phenomenon that transports heat and cold, captures much of the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but it's the carbon in the ocean. Blue carbon ocean life is beginning to get traction, but we need to hurry. We need to understand that, like planting trees, green carbon, if you will, we need to think about the carbon cycle as it relates to the living ocean. That's the headline that needs to be really made clear as a consequence of the ocean at this conference, to make a sense of urgency about looking at the ocean as a living system, looking at the planet as a living system. It's what you do, Johan. You look at the Earth not just as numbers, not just as physical features, but it's a living planet. And we're a part of it. We're carbon-based units too, part of the carbon cycle. And we all can do it. Follow the carbon. Economists follow the money. Let's follow the carbon. And it takes us right into the ocean with a need to change our attitude about how we address the ocean. We need an ocean ethic, an ethic of caring.
Thank you, Sylvia. And you just touched on what Johan's work, tipping points, planetary boundaries. Johan, you've been working on this for a number of years. Are you finally seeing this thinking, this understanding embedded in the negotiators and the private sector here at COP26?
Yeah, thanks. And I think that the simple answer is not enough. I think it's fair to say that there are two parties lacking inside the negotiating rooms here, and as Xiye points out, one of them is the future, but the second one is the planet. And it's a bit awkward because this is all about the planet and the future, and they're not represented in the room. And what I mean by that is, of course, it's not that I'm accusing the climate negotiators not to take the climate crisis seriously, but very few negotiators understand that we are talking of a complex, interconnected, self-adapting system, which, as Sylvia points out, is all dependent on the resilience of the living systems in the ocean and on land, and that we have today mapped roughly 20 tipping element systems, which are the living systems that have multiple stable states separated by tipping points, and they regulate the state of the climate system. And we are, for 9 of them, coming at a point where we scientifically can talk of, coming closer to tipping points, and the IPCC even maps 5 of these 9. And these are, the Arctic sea ice, the Greenland ice sheet, the overturning of heat in the North Atlantic, the Amazon rainforest, and the West Antarctic ice shelf. They're even in the IPCC, and this is like the fundamental basis of the consensus across the entire scientific community. So that's why when Xiye looks at me saying that, we talk about 1.5, yes, 1.5 is a real climate planetary boundary. We go beyond it and we take huge risks. We take huge risks in the stability of the planet. For whom? For future generations. And then we, as the adult generation, are on the watch on planet Earth now. And we are at this time step at risk of handing over a planet where we have, in the IPCC language, irreversible commitments. And irreversible commitments, what is that? Well, that is handing over to Xiye and the next generations a planet that irreversibly just drifts in the wrong direction. And this is what we have to stop. That's why the planet has to be in the negotiating room. And it's not there prominently enough. So it's about speed and accelerating to a safe space for future generations. And that's why we're so concerned.
Well, Johan, aren't the tipping points opportunities to be turning points?
Absolutely. I mean, if we are stewards of the planetary system and maintain the resilience, they are our best friend. That's what's so phenomenal. 150 years of our fossil fuel-driven era, almost at least 120 of those years, the planet has just been serving us silently as Mother Earth, as a the biggest subsidy to the world economy is the ocean absorbing 90% of the heat, ocean and land absorbing 56%.
The living ocean.
Living ocean. Living ocean.
Make sure that.
So, but it's now that we're seeing cracks in that system. But if we can turn this around and become stewards of the tipping element system, meaning the rainforest, the temperate forest, the coral reef systems, the permafrost
the
in
fish.
Siberia, the fish, all the living systems, then of course we can, navigate this in a way that serves us.
That's fantastic, Johan. It's the sort of language and concepts that we really need to embed in the financial markets, in banks, in companies. And at the moment, we've got a long way before that's happening, right? We need to get this understanding embedded in what we're doing day to day. These day-to-day decisions that we're making do not take into account these concepts, these issues and these risks, the irreversibility issues. Now, talking of which, Johan and Sylvia, you are scientists. Your life has been to tell the truth, to bring the truth out, to bring scientific facts onto the table. Xiye, I know this means a lot to you about the truth as well, about honesty and integrity. You talk a lot about you wanting to see more integrity and honesty from companies, from countries, about where we are, where we're heading towards. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that youth activists and people who care about climate in general is we have been lied to for a long time. by the fossil fuel industry, by other industries, about not only what's happening to the planet and creating that chain of misinformation, but also about what they're doing about that misinformation. And now we are seeing a lot of companies trying to tell us that they're investing in renewable energy, when in reality they are still drilling for oil, they're still pushing those things forward. Just in Scotland, you know, an activist, my friend Lauren, confronted the CEO of Shell just 3 weeks ago at the TED Countdown conference. And she told him, you know, you are just not saying that, you're just not telling us the truth. You're lying to us about what you care about. And you come on here and you tell us that you care about future generations and that you're going to transition out of fossil fuels while still pushing the Cambo oil field. And those things are like red flags to us. If in 50 years or 20 years I see Shell solar, I'm not going to feel comfortable with that because they have been lying to us. And I think that a lot of companies need to learn from this. We want a just transition to renewable energy, and we want a just transition of the economic sector to being sustainable, and we want all of these things. But if you come to us and you say you're doing it and you're not really doing it, you're tainting your own legacy and you're making us distrust you. And we don't want to do that because we want to believe that you are on our side. And we want to believe that you are listening to the science and understanding the earth as the complex system that it is. So for us, it's about really asking yourselves, what do I gain from lying to people? Why do I gain from not being transparent? And the answer is, you just gain that we don't trust you and we don't want to be on your side. And it's the same for governments. Do you want to add something, Sylvia?
I just want to say nature does not lie. We need to listen to nature, all of us. And you're right. Humans sometimes don't pay attention to what is perfectly obvious.
Yeah, and on that note, I think that we feel that we are living in a society that is so fast-paced, and it is. You know, we have social media going on all the time, news coming out all the time, but in reality, I think that we're not present enough. Sometimes we're not realizing what we are doing to Mother Earth and the planet. We are not seeing Mother Earth crying for help. And I'm sure, Sylvia, by your observations, you see it all the time. And I just want everyone here to take a deep breath and just feel the pain that youth are feeling, that future generations are feeling, that the earth is feeling, and that environmental protectors have been feeling. Because it's time for that shift in consciousness. It's time for us to center climate justice. It's time for us to stop lying to ourselves, because that doesn't get us anywhere. And it's the first thing my dad taught me. My dad is right there. You know, you don't lie about what you're going to do. You don't say, I'm going to clean my room and not clean it. And the most important thing is that you leave any place that you're in better than you found it. And we are not doing that.
Well, it's back to the irreversibility point that Johan made, isn't it? That actually we could be heading to a point where we actually can't get some elements back again. Although there are some very positive stories that I know Sylvia talks about in terms of regeneration and restoration and the return of the whales, for example. There are some amazing stories if we give the space to the planet to regenerate. But Xiye, this is COP number 26. You're 19 years of age, which means the COP started before you were born. Now, since COP1, global emissions, let me rephrase that, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere has actually risen by 13% since COP1 started. So we're now at number 26. We have not made a dent, really, in emissions. How do you feel about that, Xiye? We're at number 26. How many do we need? Keeping in mind that we not have to get to net zero emissions, we have to get to positive outcomes, because we've actually got to bring that 413, 415 ppm down to about 350, Johan, for real stable climatic systems. So we've got to draw the emissions out of the atmosphere, or the concentration out of the atmosphere. So how do you feel about that? In terms of where we are, 26 COPs?
Well, it's funny because I ask people, how many COPs have you been to? And they say 13, 14. And they talk to each other and they say, remember Paris, remember Copenhagen. And I don't want to be in a COP, a COP in 5 years, still talking about the same things and just telling people, remember Madrid, remember Glasgow. And it just shouldn't be like that. It should be about us coming together and not only talking in this international forum, but bringing it down to our countries, bringing it down to our, like anything that countries agree in here, there should be immediately a legislation that is put forward in each country. The deforestation agreement that was just passed to stop deforestation by 2030 was the same agreement that was signed in 2014 to stop deforestation in 2020. So these are unfulfilled promises, and we can't keep having unfulfilled promises. So when you say 26 years, the UN has been around for, 75 years now, and 75 years, and COP is not as long as the UN has been here, but we cannot just keep saying the next COP is going to be the COP of action, when in reality every single day has to be the moment of reflection and shifting to the right direction.
Thanks, Xiye. Well, on that point, I'd like now to turn to making reference to the number of people who are online. A lot of them are actually young people of your age, or maybe just a little bit older. For example, thousands of our young people at Citi all around the world. And I'd like to ask you, what's your view about your role as an activist? Keeping in mind, this is not your job, right? I mean, you're a student. At least I and Johan and Sylvia can argue these are our jobs. You're here as a volunteer to help change the world. Is activism that you're doing, is that consistent with being an employee at a large company, whether it's at Citi or at any other large companies or financiers around the world? How can you connect with those young people who we, for example, employ every year out of university to join companies like ours? Is your form of activism, and that includes justice in activism, how consistent is it with being a young employee in a large company? And what would you like to say to those young employees?
Well, the first thing that I was more conscious into where we're going to be working and what we're going to be wanting from those companies. And I see, especially I'm at the University of Pennsylvania, so there's a lot of finance people there, and I'm surrounded by them every day, and I'm seeing the shift in consciousness even there at these schools where, business is the number one thing that people want to go after. But even there, I see, my own roommates saying, I'm going to be a sustainability consultant at this firm. And that, I think, is what it means to recognize that the climate crisis touches every single sector, which means that every single sector is needed for solutions. And as an activist, it's not contradictory to go into these sectors and say, we want you to do better, because that is what activism in our life looks like. So we have to be in these spaces, and we march on the street so that I can be here and talk with you, so that I get a seat at the table in spaces like this. And what I would like to say is, we're gonna push you and we're gonna hold you accountable, and we want you to do better. And I think youth who work at these companies, they can do their activism within and say, we want you to work for our future. These are stakeholders at the end of the day. We're stakeholders of what the future is going to look like. So I don't want to also take too much space.
But what's the alternative? Do nothingism? Shouldn't everybody look in the mirror and do something, whatever you call it? Activism shouldn't be necessarily a career. It should be something that you just do. As you say, try to leave the place better than you find it every day. Or you can do nothing and be part of the problem.
So on that theme now, engagement with companies and investors, question for you, Johan, should we have big coal in the room here? Should we have the major oil companies in the room? Keeping in mind you do have a big bank in the room. So what is your view on that, Johan? We're obviously in a process of transition, of trying to get companies, the private sector and countries to transition, if not to transform their business models. And I'd like to go through all of you to get all of your perspectives on this. But Johan, starting with you, what's your view on that level of engagement that we need? Well, it's a loaded question, but the level of engagement we want to have.
Yeah, and let me come to that via the previous question, because I totally agree with you, Xiye, about the frustration about 26 COP meetings and that we are just kind of pushing the can down the road. And I'm not defending the COP process, but I mean, one should also look at it from a slightly different perspective, to just look around what's happening here, and the recognition that the world is in Glasgow. This is the most important agenda item in the world today. You walk through the media corridors here, every big news outlet is in Glasgow. This is like this is the shit. And this is where it's happening, and the fact that we're not delivering, true, but we've crossed a line where the climate crisis is now, the German elections just recently, to replace the most respected politician in Europe, if not the world, Angela Merkel, was a climate election. You couldn't be participating in that election unless you had a climate agenda. So I think in that sense, to come to your point here, Keith, I think businesses are here because they recognize that this is, whatever argument you use, it's either about survival for the company, it's about competitiveness, it's about having any chance of competing in the market in the future, but it's also a question of going, just like Johan Seitz and Paul Polman and others maintain, going beyond just profitability as the only way of measuring success and value. And therefore, from the science community, we are engaging much, much more actively with the business community today. Not because we think we can get every company in a certain sector to tip over, but to find the keystone actors and to get the big banks like Citi on board, because when you get it's quite interesting, you can go through almost any sector in the world and you'll find that you have a myriad and thousands of companies, but often there's only 10, 15 of those that are the keystone actors globally that can tip the logic. Look at the IT industries, the Googles and the Amazons of the world, and look at the heavy truck industry. It's just 6 of them in Europe. The big actors, Daimler, the world's biggest truck manufacturer, is such a dominant player. You get them to tip, and they can really filter over across the entire landscape. So I think we should not underestimate the power of S-curves and exponential change also in the interface with business. So, that's one of the places I see some promise, actually.
Could I comment? Large business entities often have more power than countries. And like everything in human society, businesses are comprised of people. And they emerge with personality, with ethics, with character. And when you find a large business entity with leadership that moves that corporation in a positive direction, using the power that they represent, then we're moving in the right direction. But instead of thinking of corporations as some anonymous blob, think of corporations as composed of people who shape the nature of each of those entities. It's the leadership, but it also starts with every participant in that company. Sometimes voices from well within the company can influence outcomes beyond what would seem possible. It's having the courage to make evidence, to look at the evidence and work in the right direction.
Well, Sylvia, staying on that theme, just to put this into context, you were born in 1935, is that correct? Yeah?
Yeah, the United Nations was, I was 10 years old when the United Nations came into being.
Yeah, so Sylvia, you have not only seen life, like probably, if I glanced around the room here, probably, I'm sure more than anyone else in this room, and maybe even online as well. You've certainly been to places that very few people have even been to, given your explorations in the deep oceans. So you've gained a perspective that very few of us actually have. as Sir David Attenborough says, you're one of the generation that were born in the Holocene and you're now living in the Anthropocene. You're one of the few people in humanity that has actually crossed a geological age. It's an extraordinary thought. Whereas, of course, most of us in the room here were born in this age of the Anthropocene. Xiye, you're 19. So, Sylvia, given your life experiences and what you've seen, if you were 19 again, if you take yourself back to 19, Xiye's age, how would you think? What would you do? Would you do anything differently? Do you have any views you'd like to express? Any messages you want to convey to Xiye and to her generation?
Well, I have never been high in the sky as astronauts. But think of what we all know, because astronauts have been high in the sky and returned with evidence of what Earth looks like from space, that we live, all of us together, on this little blue biogeochemical miracle we call Earth. It's our home. It's our only home. I've had the privilege of spending thousands of hours in the other direction as a witness, living underwater on 10 different occasions, using dozens of different little submersibles to explore the inside of the planet that very few people have had the privilege of seeing. And I want to share that view with you, Xiye, and the rest of the world, just as astronauts share their view from high in the sky, that Earth is alive, that most of life on Earth is in the ocean. It's really in trouble. That means we are in trouble, because the chemistry of the ocean, the chemistry of the planet is changing. And if I were some evil alien wishing to, eliminate human beings, what would you do? You change the chemistry of the planet, you change the temperature of the planet. We're doing both of those things. And it looks like a lot of bad news as you come along. As a citizen, as all of us are of the 21st century, we are 21st century human beings. But in a way, I think of you as among the luckiest people who've ever arrived on Earth. Why? Because what we now know that no one, not even the smartest people like Einstein, could not know what you have available to you. We've learned more in the last few decades, since the 1950s, since the Anthropocene officially began as geologists mark time. We've learned more, but at the same time, we've lost more. But imagine if we didn't know. Imagine if we didn't have Johan crunching the numbers with your colleagues to alert us to the danger we are in. Imagine if we thought the ocean, as we have throughout most of our history, was too big to fail, that we could take whatever we wanted out of it, put anything we wanted into it. Now we know that that habit, that attitude, is really dangerous. But we have time, not a lot, this next 10 years, maybe the turning point instead of the tipping point. And you, now armed with what no 19-year-old could know when I was 19, but you know, it's that superpower that not only you, but everyone around you has access to the evidence. It's a matter of waking up and taking it really seriously. The fact that we've gotten by doing terrible things to the land, the wildlife, and the ocean, and we're still breathing. We still have a planet that more or less works in our favor. But you know that we have to change. And your power, because it's your future, we all are invested in the next 10 years, one hopes. What are we waiting for? And having you take to heart and see what no one could see decades ago is cause for hope. It really is. And to embrace the land and see this idea of by 2030 to protect at least at least 30% of the natural systems that maintain Earth as a habitable place, at least 30% of the ocean, at least half of the world by 2050. We don't have to wait that long to protect the blue heart, the green heart of the planet. I mean, why not yesterday? Or at least why not get busy right now?
That's beautiful. Yeah, and expanding on that, I think that one of the things that youth can bring to the table, that because we have all this knowledge now, is being able to imagine that future and having the courage to imagine that future. I did an exercise one time where somebody said, close your eyes and imagine a young person in your life in 30 years. And most people in the room started crying, because when you imagine your 5-year-old being 35, it's very emotional. And then that person said, now imagine that person when they're 90. And now imagine them looking at the window. What do they see? And a lot of people saw a dystopia and a lot of people saw utopia. And what I want to see is a future that we're proud of, a future that we're proud of building. And I think that the most important thing we have, as Christiana Figueres says, is stubborn optimism. The optimism of we can change the world and we have to, because we're creative and innovative enough, and now we have the knowledge that we need. And this knowledge is not only scientific now, but also is, indigenous knowledge, ancient knowledge about how the earth works. And we have this idea that every solution is going to work everywhere, but each part of the earth is different. Each part of the earth has its own attitude, which means each part of the earth needs its own stewardship. And we have to connect to that. We have to connect to the fact that we're all different and that diversity is beautiful. And, in Otomi, which is the language that my dad speaks and my community speaks, the word for skin is the same as the word for the outer layer of the earth. So when you hurt the earth, you hurt yourselves. And a lot of this language is not included in, or this meaning is not included in English or other, Latin languages. And that's why we have to not only think about protecting people who protect the earth, but also letting them protect us and have that reciprocity in protection.
So Xiye, when you look out that window, and you might see despair, but there's also opportunity. We've lost about half of the coral reefs, mangroves, seagrass meadows, 90% of the sharks, tunas, swordfish, you name it, on the land. We're on a track. If you continue doing what we're doing, the loss of diversity, of language, of the fabric of life itself. But you can see, looking out that window, we still got 10% of the sharks left. There are about 3% of the bluefin tuna remaining in the Pacific. They're not all gone. We're watching some ecosystems, some species wink out as we look out at the diversity of life and the diversity of languages and of cultures. But isn't this the best chance we will ever have now to do the change that and to take it seriously? Shouldn't that be the outcome of this gathering of mighty minds? It really take this as a chance to go from this to this and do it as if our lives depend on it.
Because they do.
As they do, yeah.
Can I just add to that straight away? Because, I think it's really important to, not surprisingly, you have the full scientific support for that narrative that, it's fantastic, isn't it, that, very few of us can go to space, very few of us can go down in the deep of the ocean. But if I may say so, science tries to substitute for us who are stuck here on land, because we try to provide the evidence of what's happening with the precious little blue, beautiful biophysical marble that we all depend on as planet Earth. And in that narrative, in that analysis, we show that yes, we have huge risks, But so far, Mother Earth is actually dampening and helping us. And the window is still open, but barely. So that's one part of the narrative. But the other part of the narrative, which in one way rightly makes the youth movement frustrated, but also is something that is the centerpiece here, is that we have the winning narrative. We're sitting on the winning story because, we have huge risks, but we have equal amount of scientific evidence that we can solve it and that the outcomes will give a better, equitable, prosperous, safe future for all communities in the world.
And life on Earth
and
as well, the rest of life on Earth.
Yeah, I mean,
it's not just about us.
Everyone on Earth. And of course, that leads one to even more reason for frustration, because how can we not act? How can you face a catastrophic risk, have the solutions with better result, and still not acting? How can you do it? That's what gives us scientists so much support to the Fridays for Future youth movement. On the other hand, it means we will win. Ultimately, we will win because, it's inevitable that we will, move in this direction. The question is just, will we do it fast enough? Sorry, Xiye.
No, yeah, that's absolutely right. And I just want to share something with all of you, which is a lot of the times I don't know how to talk to people in power about how we feel. I sometimes want to talk to them like I'm upset and be like, why are you doing this to us? And sometimes I want to talk to them like how hopeful I am about the opportunities that we have and say like, we can do this. All we need is for you to open your hearts and go out and breathe in some clean air and realize how precious it is that we have it. And sometimes, we want to be sad, and sometimes like we have all of these emotions of hope and also feeling a little betrayed. And I don't think we should put those emotions away because, historically, all of these decisions have been made without emotion, without women in rooms, without children in rooms, without any of the things that make us human.
Without whales in the room.
Without whales in the room. And now that's changing. And like Johan said, the media has never been this concentrated on an event, like in a COP event ever. And I'm seeing that just from looking at Madrid and then looking at Glasgow here. It's incremental, the impact that we're having. But in terms of how youth feel, we have all of these mixtures of emotions. And what we want at the end of the day is for this to be an intergenerational conversation where it's not youth talking to everyone and saying, please look at what we're trying to do, but actually say, how do we work together for this world that we have, and realize that it's not us against you, but it's all of us for the planet. And you just have given me so much happiness right now because you have shown me it's not everything that we've lost, but everything that we still have.
I'm not sure what to say after that, other than to say that I'll add one comment rather than a question. That is, in the finance community, when we talk about the oceans, we talk about Earth systems, and we talk about youth. There's a concept in the financial markets which is the discount rate. The discount rate inherently discounts the future in favour of the current of today. And here we are effectively embedding in all our financial models a discount rate that actually discounts Xiye and her generation. It's bizarre, but we do it. That's part of the financial system at the moment. So one of the things that we're looking at Citi is how do we integrate everything that Xiye and Sylvia and Johan talk about into the financial markets? How do we do that? It's not easy. In fact, it's very complex. If it were easy, we would have done it. But it has to be done. As Johan says, we will win. It's just a question of how much damage is done before we do win, because the planet will not allow us to lose. So it's a case of us actually trying to drive that innovation and the power of the youth who come through from university with the ideas to drive that into the financial markets, the capital markets, the day-to-day decisions that we see. Because at the moment, these elements are not valued. They're not in the spreadsheets. They're not at the bottom line, which makes the decision-making quite distorted at times. Sylvia.
So I don't know whether this is a question for you or not, but maybe to
It wasn't part of the agenda for you to ask me questions, Sylvia. But
it's how can we continue to justify investing in enterprises that continue to take bites out of what remains of the natural old growth forests the old-growth deserts, the old-growth ocean, like coral reefs that have been around for thousands of years, or now deep-sea mining that is proposing to take big bites out of systems, living systems, that have taken hundreds of millions of years and they're still living and growing. And we justify it based on short-term profits, but we're still doing it despite the clear evidence that our highest priority must be to embrace as much of the natural undisturbed, such as they are. 5% of the old growth forest in North America is about all that remains. Hold on to it. Don't continue to kill 1,000-year-old trees. Planting trees is a great idea, but not killing what remains intact is an even better idea. And in the ocean, we need to restore rather than to subsidize large-scale industrial killing of wild animals. It's the biggest wildlife trade on the planet, and we're subsidizing it. And we're doing it with our eyes open, without really understanding that this is the best chance we will ever have to reverse the decline and to recover the basic systems that you have identified and articulated so beautifully. And it's not that we don't know. What is it that is going to cause us to make the right choices? Because it is a choice. It is a choice.
It is a choice. I agree entirely. Xiye, you want to add to that?
The only thing that I would like to add to put this into perspective is that we always think of having to go forward and having to find the next new thing and the next solution. And sometimes we have to think about going back to what makes us human, and going back to traditional knowledge, and going back to, just remembering where we come from. And there is this indigenous saying that says, we have to make every decision counting the wisdom of the past 7 generations to ensure the stability of the future 7 generations. And the 7-generation principle is not included in short-term profit. And it's also not included in investments. And we have to start including those things, because for, like Johan just pointed out, for the past 150 to 200 years, we have made a dent in our impact as humanity that we hadn't made for the tens of thousands of years that we've been here. And at least we know, and we can revert that. And I think we haven't been running so fast, we haven't been able to breathe and notice the impact that we've been having. So in terms of the financial market, and I know it's such a big question in everything that has to do with climate, and how do you put value to things. Well, I want a value in my experiences, a value in my joy, a value in the security of not having to run away from floods and wildfires and hurricanes. And we can't just keep valuing things that don't have those emotions embedded in them. And it's very hard to think about how to value these things. And some countries have done gross domestic happiness instead of gross domestic product. But we have to be creative about how we value these things. And I sound very naive coming on here and saying you have to value my happiness. But I think the naive ones are people who don't think that's possible. And the pessimists are people who think that we can't change the world.
We must.
Well said. On another note of optimism there, what I have seen in the financial markets is that the net zero by 2050 language has actually fundamentally changed the time frame for many, many in the private sector. In the 80s and 90s, if we'd spoken to CEOs about thinking about your business model in 30 years' time, we would have been laughed out the room. Whereas now, we're all talking to businesses about what you have to look like in 30 years' time, because it actually is the net zero by 2050 that science is driving it. So, Xiye, on that point of optimism about I believe we are getting a longer term perspective into the business community, into the capital markets, finally, and in the interests of you and your generation. I could sit here for hours just listening to these three. I know all of you could as well. Unfortunately, we are out of time. But this is a conversation we want to continue. It's very, very complex issues. But we all are in this together. We all have a very clear objective, and that is to create a future which is regenerative, which is good for people around the world, which is even better for you and your generation, Xiye, and not one that is worse. We're all in here working for you and for your friends and your generation. On that point, you're marching. Youth Day is tomorrow, and you're marching on Saturday. I'd like you to close the. But before we do go, I do want to mention there is a fantastic show on tomorrow evening across the river on the Armadillo, which is the change, projecting change. Thank you, Chip. The projecting change. You will see Johan, Sylvia, and Xiye on the projecting change. So please come along tomorrow evening and look at these 3 stars on there. So, Xiye, final word to you.
I actually, on the interest of intergenerational inclusion, I would like to give the last word to both Johan and Sylvia.
I would like to give it to Sylvia. She's the star.
No, we're all in this together. I have one thought, though, that occurred while we're sitting here, and that is, every generation wants the next generation to have a life that's better than the life that they've lived. That's how we've progressed it over the ages. And you want to have money in the bank, or you want property, you want something to give to the next generation. But Xiye, what you have, what the current 21st century kids have, is the greatest gift that any generation could convey. And that is the knowledge that we currently have that is unprecedented. And it's the best opportunity that any of us will ever have to get it right. And instead of thinking, woe is us, it's all over, no, let's celebrate the joy of being alive right now, armed with knowledge, armed with maybe the last best opportunity, but it's going to get harder if we don't do something now, but why not? Let's just go for it. And I see you doing just that. You are truly cause for hope.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say is that, a lot of people come to youth activists and they tell us, thank you for your activism. And I would actually like to thank you for something that you've done. So my message for everyone is to do something. And everyone here is in that space because you're a COP. But outside of these walls, we want to be able to thank people for what they're doing, not just them thanking us for doing the work. We have to be reciprocal in our actions that we say, that we do, and that we thank for.
That closes our session. Thank you, everyone.
We can all stand up together, a photo together.